Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Today, I'm joined by a guest to talk about a topic that isn't spoken about enough, in my view, and that is about profit and purpose, and particularly our discomfort as women in particular with seeking profit and making wealthy and commercial choices when we are actually driven by a real sense of purpose and or impact. Certainly something I've seen a lot of in the DEI space, but also for any kind of new consultants, solopreneurs, entrepreneurs that find themselves with the opportunity to follow their passions, follow something driven by purpose, where quite frankly, they would happily do it for free. They're so passionate about it. And I'm joined today by someone who is so passionate about this topic that she's actually written a book on it. She is Helen McGuire. Now, Helen started her career in the corporate communications industry and found herself in the diversity and inclusion space after her own lived experiences moving and transitioning back into the workplace after having kids. And solving that issue for her led her down the startup founder route. And she created Diversely.io with her co-founder Haley Backer back in 2020. And it was the world's first AI-driven DEI platform. Now, Diversely.io was acquired at the end of last year by a leading software company, the Access Group. And so now Helen has become that most consummate of multi-hyphenates as a mum of three, an entrepreneur, an exited founder, an author. She's also a certified Reiki master and a photographer. Welcome to the podcast, Helen. So much to get stuck into here.
Thank you so much. That was, quite some intro. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to live up to all of those adjectives and descriptors, but thank you. It's so lovely to be here.
No, now, Helen, you need to fill the gaps for us a little bit and take me through this journey, because when we think DEI, as I sort of touched on a bit in the intro, sometimes there can be a real discomfort with thinking of it as a really profit-making endeavor. But also we tend to be comfortable with likening, DEI or connecting DEI with education, with workshops and training, consulting, activism, social justice. We don't often link it to a hustling startup founder. So take us through that journey from inception to founder and exiting and getting acquired.
Yeah, it's been a long journey. So as you correctly identified, my journey started just over 9 years ago now when I had my first baby. I'd moved from London to Dubai. My previous career had been in BBC and communications through radio and audio and podcasts and all sorts of things, broadcasting via BBC Radio 1 around the world, and then moved into advertising when I moved here to Dubai, which is where I live right now. And to be honest, I'd never really felt a major sense of injustice or difficulty in that space as a woman. It is a very male-driven space. Here, particularly, the advertising industry is quite male-driven, and the broadcast industry at senior levels at home in the UK was certainly very male-driven as well. So I was surrounded by mostly guys, where I was pretty comfortable. I've always been fairly 50-50 in my friendship groups where that's concerned as well. I never really noticed it until I had a baby here in 2014 and realized that so many of my friends, my colleagues, women that I met in different baby groups and through my networks were not returning to work, that there was very, very little opportunity for them to get back into the workplace. Partly because of the way that the workplace was set up here. It was very kind of, as I said, male dominated, but also not very flexible in its thinking and its ways of working. We were way before #MeToo. We were definitely pre-pandemic at this point. Remote work was really not on the agenda of the vast majority of companies globally, and particularly here. where it's always a little bit behind the curve. The Gender Balance Council, which was set up in 2016 here, had yet to be created. So although there were noises from government level and from kind of the upper echelons of society and government in the region around improving gender equality and around improving gender representation, there was nothing really on the ground that was connecting the dots between those women that had fallen off the career ladder, who were incredibly well educated, who had 15, 20 years of career background, but just couldn't find the opportunity, and those businesses that were trying to connect the dots there and find that talent and bring them back into the workforce and so on. And it became so frustrating for me seeing this amongst my friendship groups and colleagues. I was lucky enough to go back to work, and I found myself one morning in a photography class. As you correctly said, photography is one of my passions, surrounded by women who are in this situation. And at the end of that class, I had a number of them come up to me saying, look, I now feel like I'm just a mum. I don't have any other purpose outside of that. I really want to get back into the workforce. Can you help me? My answer was no, because I'm not, I wasn't at that point a recruiter or in HR or any of those types of things. I didn't have those types of connections, but my husband had a recruitment business at that point in time and still does now, much bigger recruitment business. And so when I put this problem to him, it was when the light bulbs really started to go off, because my idea was to try to connect those two sides of the coin via a platform that enabled education around flexible work, accessibility to flexible work, and an opportunity really for both businesses and women to move forward, specifically in the gender space. Now, as you correctly pointed out at the beginning, this line between purpose and profit is often one that is left unexplored when we're talking about purposeful businesses. And certainly where I was concerned at this point in my career, I didn't start this to make money, right? And to the point where I would have conversations and arguments with people who eventually became part of my team around what we should be charging or whether we should be charging women at all, for example. And it became a very difficult route to follow, because it wasn't my initial intention, I suppose, to make profit out of this problem. But I realized over my years trying to solve this that actually, if that line between your passion point, your purpose, whatever that ends up being, wherever you're trying to solve a particular problem, and profit that comes off the back of it, isn't an unbroken line, then unfortunately you will fall down at some point along that road, because it will become unsustainable as a business. And if it's unsustainable as a business, you are not going to get to grips with the original. So that's where my journey started, really, on this whole purpose profit conundrum, if you like. And as you say, 10 years later, eventually got to the point where I sold my business, exited from my second business, and hopefully have managed to tie those different knots together, if you like.
Yeah. And I'm really curious, Helen, when you said that even for you at that stage when you were setting it up, it was a really big barrier to you to know, should you even charge, let alone what to charge. What was it for you in particular that gave you that conflict?
I think because you was, for my first business, so my first business was called Hopscotch. It was essentially a women's careers platform, and it supported women across a number of different areas. So we would put on big events and conferences and summits and workshops and so on for women. Some of those were led by big corporates. We had a jobs board that was based around flexible work, so opening up that world to both corporates and to the women themselves. And we had a number of kind of in corporate training programs and workshops as well that we used to run. And I think the conflict was always around, okay, surely what we should be doing is charging the corporates for this and not charging the women necessarily. But actually, this is all an investment in your future and in, what you're aiming to do. And sadly, we do live in a commercial world. We live in a world where money talks and business is the bedrock of anything, and your bottom line is the bedrock of anything. And in order to move forward, there has to be some kind of investment, some kind of energy exchange around that. So actually doing things for free often isn't the answer, because you're not getting the value across to people when you do that. So things like free trials, things like free events, you'll find that people, for example, will register for those types of events, and then you'll get a 20% turnout rate, which means that nobody's really moving forward or getting anywhere. Whereas when you actually start to put a monetary value around things and to genuinely talk about that over price, let's say, then it starts to become something that people will value and will put their time and their effort and their resource into, and consequently get something out of as well. So the whole kind of free thing just doesn't really pay off in the end. And I think it's not just about making money out of it, it's about that sort of value exchange as well that's really important when we're talking about the women's side of things when I first started.
Yeah, I was often hear this adage of paying people pay attention, and I really resonate with that. Where if you say get something for free, you take it. You therefore don't assign a value to it necessarily, and it makes it easier to avoid to not kind of show up with your full self in a way that you have if you paid for something and you've pegged it as such. And in your work and through your businesses, working with other women and helping them through those transitions, did you see that converse side in terms of actually that reticence that spreads throughout in others to ask for what they want, to push profit in their own agendas? And I often think, when I'm thinking about this, I really think about this identity and how we link that to how we view making money and profiting. I sort of alluded to it with respect to people in DEI that sometimes actually just feel uncomfortable asking for money for themselves, and they can also hold a lot of judgment towards those that are seen to profit heavily from doing similar work. I'm interested on your perspectives on that and any experiences that you had of it. And also almost whether you felt when you moved into this space from your comms and advertising and other kind of corporate roles, was there an identity shift for you as to suddenly you're like, oh, I'm now in this DEI space that you never saw yourself in?
Yeah, no, massively. And I talk about that quite a lot in the book, because the journey for me from being, in a very creative space where my currency was essentially my audience. It was, eyeballs or ears or whatever on the different content that I was creating, whether that was for the BBC through programming or whether it was through advertising and digital content and so on. And then suddenly switching that to much more of a financial perspective of, who is going to pay for this, who's going to invest in this in order to move things forward. That was a massive personal shift for me. And I think that off the back of that, pricing has always been, a big challenge in this space. And, I would look at it, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion now, the journey that I went on with my first business was understanding what the core of the issues are around that. So what sits at the heart of the problems of a lack of equity in the workplace, a lack of accessibility, a lack of inclusion, and obviously off the back of that, a lack of diversity. And what can we do to try and solve those problems? Because this isn't actually a moral issue, it's a business issue. If you are narrowing your line of sight so much that actually everybody in your business looks, feels, sounds, comes from the same backgrounds, then your perspectives, your understanding of your market, your understanding of the audiences that you're trying to reach, as well as the innovation in that business and eventually the profitability of that business, all decline by about 30%. Most of the studies that are done around this show that it's around a 30% decline. So the problem is not one of ethics necessarily. We all know that it's the right thing to do. It's a genuine business problem. It comes down to the bottom line. It comes down to money. And as soon as I kind of made that connection between diversity, equity, and inclusion and the profit side of it, then I realized there was a business case. And as soon as there's a business case for something, there is a business that you can start to build around it. Now, as it happened, my first business, Hopscotch, was not that business model. It was too much of an in-person, surface level business. So we worked with huge organizations like Amazon and UN Women, HSBC, Nestle, I mean, you name it, household names left, right, and center,
Yeah.
putting on these workshops, giving access to different opportunities for women, both in the Middle East and then moving it over into Asia. But actually, it was only scratching the surface, because you had 80,000 women on my platform at one point wanting these kinds of opportunities, but you weren't solving or getting across the real value of what this meant for businesses. And therefore, they weren't willing to change their ways in order to access this, and they weren't willing to pay for it. So that's when I started to switch my model and started to work towards much more of a B2B approach than a B2C approach. And that's when the profitability and the more commercial aspects, let's say, of diversity, equity, inclusion started to make sense. We are not running a charity here. We are not trying to solve some kind of nice to have problem. We are trying to solve something that is so crucial and so integral to businesses that we all need to move forward, and we all need to get paid for that. And I think I feel very passionately about that, as I do about other purposeful businesses and their part in society and their part in the business world.
You touched on something there that I also think doesn't sort of connect so easily with people that work in that space, where it's, in person, it might be consulting, it might be based on the time that you're putting in. And that for me is this scalability piece, and how you can get as much bang for your own buck and for your own kind of efforts and time to come out the other side of it. Can you take us through that piece, that shift from that hopscotch to Diversely, and just I really want you to be able to share this with those who might be listening, who maybe don't even know how to think beyond their own, solopreneur business, or just that kind of, doing the speaking gigs, doing the consulting. What was that thought process? And actually, how much can we learn from the founder and startup and entrepreneurship journey that anything could be that big growth business if you put the right things in place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two things here. Number one, I became really frustrated with the lack of impact. So for me, the line between having a passion point around, or a frustration, let's say, something that kind of keeps you awake at night. I ended up, before I launched my first business, running a survey across about 400 women, and the results were ridiculous. It was something like 98% of women would return to work tomorrow if they could find flexible work, and over half of businesses were looking for women, increasing women and gender representation within their workforce. When you've got something like that, it becomes a real passion point, and you can't stop thinking about it, and you can't stop talking about it, and you feel that it's your responsibility almost to try and solve that in whatever way you can. The first step on that journey is to figure out which bit of that problem you want to solve, because generally speaking, purposeful businesses solve huge problems in society. It might be around poverty, might be around climate change, might be around diversity, you name it. But you cannot solve that problem for everybody. You need to niche down on specifically what area you want to solve that problem within. For me, it was around the sourcing, it was around the talent attraction part of things. And I went through that process with Hopscotch of opening those doors as widely as I possibly could, of changing the way that businesses communicate about what they're doing and about their roles, changing their internal policies and showcasing those in a different way in order to attract more women to their ranks and in order to give more women those opportunities. The issue, as you say, is where the scalability bit comes in, because doing that on a kind of personal basis and being the front person of the business, there is only so much time in the day. And so as a person who wants to solve a bigger problem in society, that will then, as second part of my argument, become incredibly frustrating for you, because you will find that you are only scratching the surface of the issue. You can only solve it for a certain level of person. You can only solve it to a certain level, within the problem and the scope of the problem itself. By the time I got to 2018, 2019, I had 3 young kids. my time was becoming more limited in many respects. My business stretched from the Middle East across to Asia. I recognized that it could not survive and sustain itself as it was, and neither could I sustain that. And neither was I creating the impacts or scratching beyond the surface of the problem. And so the problem still existed. For me, it didn't really change enough. And that's when I started to think, okay, what do I need to do to get deeper into the roots of this problem and solve it from the ground up? And that's where the idea around tech really came in. I do not have a tech background. I am not a tech person in anyone will tell you that in any way, shape, or form. So I knew I wasn't going to be able to solve this on my own, but I knew that I had a huge network. I had a lot of cachet in the industry. I had a lot of ideas. I kind of got things off the ground and I tested things sort of in person. So how could I start to switch that into something that was scalable, that I could productize, that I could sell into businesses, and that was a bit more automated in terms of the way that it was working? So that would be my recommendation for anyone who is doing this kind of thing, to think about what the crux of the issue is that you're solving for somebody, whether you're a solopreneur, whether you're a coach, whether you're, starting a business yourself and you have a startup. What's the crux of the issue, and how can you start to turn that into something digital, something online, something that's accessible, without you always having to be the person that's taking the time to deliver that yourself, or to spend the time in kind of promoting it yourself as well. And that's where that switch really occurred for me. And that was then a whole other journey.
Yeah. And it's that mental shift that, as you were speaking, I think that's something that even I personally really had to get on board with, is when we have that resistance to thinking bigger, to actually thinking of it as driving profit, is actually when you flip it to think, actually, what do I need in order to be able to grow my impact to the maximum amount possible? And that's where you might need tech. You are going to need more money. And this is not about feeding your own pockets. This is about feeding the growth of your own business and your journey and the impact that you can have. It feels like there are just so many mindsets that just need to shift in order to reduce the amount of friction between starting something up and getting the success and the impact that you want. And then, Kate, talk me through this book. So I think it's due to be out later this year. I think you've just sort of put pens down on this book, The Female Scale. What's the passion that was driving this book, and what are you hoping to achieve or serve? How are you hoping to serve others through The Female Scale, Helen?
Yeah, look, it's many of the points that we've touched on already in this conversation. So around the fact that so many women, the majority of women, when they start their businesses, they start with a problem in mind. They start with something either they've experienced, they've had perhaps a family member or a friend experience, or they've witnessed that really bugs them, and that they feel that there's a better way of solving these problems. But typically speaking, many women also have lots of caring responsibilities. Increasingly, we are seeing, obviously, these responsibilities falling to both genders, and in between genders as well, obviously. But classically, we are the person in the family that will be taking care of the kids, particularly when they're very young. I was 7 months pregnant when I started my first business. I had a 12-month-old at home, and I now have 3 kids under the age of 10. So there is a lot in the book about how to manage that process, and just how to back yourself through that, and to believe that you can do it, and not, for want of a better term, make excuses around the fact that there's lots of other stuff going on. There are ways around this, and if you can commit to solving a problem, you will always find ways of working that work best for you and that keep moving things forward. But more than that, it's really about understanding the principles of building a purposeful business and how to use those to your advantage. So I've identified 7 principles through the book, which essentially take you through my journey of building those 2 businesses, and then looking at the theory behind that, and then the practice of what you can do to apply that to your own journey and to your own business and how to grow that. Because I think once you get to, as I said, to a certain stage within a business, and you want to start to scale it, there are processes, there are, as you say, different things that you need to start bringing on board, like investment, for example, which is not where women are typically seen as successful. I think it's something like under 2% of investment goes to women still, despite the fact that the ROI from female businesses is almost 30% up from male founded businesses. So there is still this disparity. And I just want to give people a roadmap so that they can understand how to go on this journey, how to back themselves, how to move it all forward without making lots of the mistakes and falling in some of the potholes that I inevitably did along the way because I didn't have a roadmap to follow.
Yeah. And I know coaching and founders and galvanizing women in this way is something that drives a lot of what you do now. What have you seen through the process of writing the book and for your work have been some of the biggest barriers, sort of those parts we talked a bit about, those mindset shifts, and we understand, when you're talking to women who have a lot going on and they'll have caring responsibilities, and we have plenty of potential excuses to use to not drive those things forward. But what are some of the other really personal barriers that you've seen to people actually leveraging more in order to get what they want?
The process that I take people through now, having sold diversely, gone down that road of successfully finding a way of getting this tech into as many hands as possible from a recruitment perspective, of solving this problem at a very fundamental level in the recruitment process, of taking bias out of recruitment through tech and through the AI, as you mentioned, that we ended up creating off the back of going through an accelerator in 2020 and building that business, is also a process of clarity. It's a process of communication. It's a process of connection, and it's a process of commercialization. And it's when you start to connect all of those dots that your business will start to make sense. And just to give you a sort of very concrete example, just from this morning, I was with one of my founders who's only been through 3 sessions with me in the last sort of 6 weeks or so. And she came to me with an idea that is relatively similar actually to my first business, but slightly more progressed, given that we are 10 years on from that. And it was a very kind of unexecutable, vague idea with, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 different directions under one umbrella, not quite sure exactly what problem we're solving, not quite sure exactly how to put that across to the market, not sure how to connect with the right people to get it out there. And this morning, after 3 sessions, she presented her findings to the British Chamber of Commerce. Here in Dubai, we now have a kind of validated hypothesis. We have a way forward. I've opened up my network to her. So I think to answer your question, there are really a few different things that people, not just women, can lack when they're starting a business. The first of them is definitely clarity. What is the problem that you're solving, and who is going to pay for that? There is that kind of Venn diagram of, your ideal target customer. And that is absolutely crucial to define before you even start building a website or getting a nice branding done or spending a load of money on all of that sort of stuff. That is incredibly important. And I don't see that very often when I'm speaking to founders, even those that are, year, 2 years into their business. The second one is your connections. So have you spent time building that, creating content, going out there, networking, making sure that you're on the right platforms, whether that's LinkedIn or Instagram or TikTok, depending on what type of business you're running, and making sure that you have that community, those connections, that support that are going to help you to push things forward. And thirdly, commercialization, go to market strategies, understanding how that works, and not spending a fortune on your advertising before you know exactly what it is that you're trying to solve and who you're trying to reach. And I've done all of these things wrong in my time, so I completely get where the kind of pitfalls are, but equally it means I can spot it so much more easily in other people's businesses. And for purposeful businesses, that is really the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's about having that clarity around what are you solving and who are you solving it for? Because as I said, you cannot solve a bigger purpose for everybody. And it's then kind of going through those steps to ensure that, like you say, it's not about filling your own pockets. It's about making sure the business can survive, making money out of it so that you can start to create that scale and that impact that's going to solve the problem that you started off in the first place. So yeah, there's a number of points there and many others probably that I could talk about, but I would say that's typically the picture that I see in some of those joins between the dots that are perhaps missing in purposeful founding.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing that. It gives a whole lot of clarity into to what it is and to creating that structure around turning those ideas and the drivers for impact into something really tangible. And I think that there's so many areas of our lives right now where you kind of want that roadmap for you from someone that's lived that journey and to see it through, and particularly someone that can talk to the challenges that you're going to see along the way, and the fact that you are navigating a path that will necessarily have very big challenges, and acknowledge the fact that the things that we don't always have control over, whether it is having all the numbers there and still knowing that only 2% of venture capital funding is going into it, and we need that in order to shift that dial, we need more people feeling really confident and having the tools that they need to get up in front of those people that can invest in their businesses, to get up in front of customers and move that dial. So I hugely encourage those of you who are listening that have had this idea, or that maybe know that they want to solve all the world's problems, and just to take that moment to reflect and go, I get it, and I hear you and I see you, but maybe you need to think about niching. Maybe you actually need to go smaller in order to grow bigger. Yeah, there's just so many talking points to take away from that, Helen. I love it. And now, to wrap us up, so as you know, that this podcast is called Unbiased, and that this year we're really sort of trying to shift that dial or move that needle from confusion, from judgment, to real curiosity. And for me, that always means that we should have more questions than answers. You've solved a lot of problems in your time. You are forging ahead with so many endeavors, Helen. But leave us with a question that remains unanswered for you, however many so-called experts they may be in the field.
God, I don't know if I have one off the top of my head, to be honest. A question that remains unanswered. Yeah, I think it's probably around the different treatment, I suppose, of men and women in the workforce. What I see quite often, particularly when living in this part of the world and living in Asia, for example, is that there is this huge disparity between what's afforded to women and what's afforded to men. And I mean that in a sense of, women these days do get more flexibility, they get maternity leave and so on. Actually, the issue that I've always had around that is that it doesn't really move the needle forward, because all it's doing is putting more pressure on women to juggle and to perform on multiple different fronts. And when we look at Europe and we see the equity around parental leave, for example, and the impact that has on the returning levels of mothers, which is far higher in places like Sweden and Finland, for example, I wonder why we don't start to look at the blueprints that are working in the world and emulate those. So that would be my question to bigger corporates and to government is, why do we not look at best practice from a global perspective and start to use that in our own practices and in our own policies and strategies, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's from a legal perspective? I hope that is a big enough question, or a good enough question for us to perhaps look into.
Yeah, it didn't even have to be so big, but that is a question and a half. How do we redress the imbalance where we could leverage other governments and policies? And is it right to actually just don all the flexibility to women? I hope you enjoyed this episode. I derive so much energy from speaking to such inspiring guests and having really meaningful and challenging conversations. If you felt the same way, my ask of you is to please subscribe to this podcast, either here or wherever you download your podcast content from. Unbiased is a labour of love for me, and the impact that these perspectives have depend on reaching as many eyes and ears as possible. So your support is invaluable. Until next time, stay curious.